She walked in like it had been the longest walk of her 8-year life, small feet dragging, a sundress that used to be bright, now streaked with dirt, 2 dark bruises blooming on her knees. Her fingers trembled as she reached up and touched my face, like she was checking I was still there. Then, in a voice so small I almost missed it, she said the thing that stopped me dead. Uncle Tom kicked me out because my mom is albino. I remember the exact way the light from the kitchen window caught the tear on her cheek. I remember the smell of lemon soap when I took off her shoes. I remember the bruise forming under the white fabric of her dress, like a private map of what had been done to her. For a moment, everything else, the house, the estate, the numbers on paper that had always felt abstract, shrank down to that little body in my arms. I ran my fingers along the bruises, careful not to make it hurt more, and tried to be only what she needed in that moment, steady, warm, real. "Come sit," I said. "Tell me where it hurts. Tell me what happened." She named the shove, the door closing, the coldness in Tom's face. She said the words he used, the excuse he offered to make room for his entitlement. I held her until the shaking stopped. Then I told her to wash the blood from under her nails and change into pajamas. I set a damp cloth on the dark swell of a bruise and kissed the place where a mother should be able to fix anything. Stay with me to see what I did next. There are things people imagine when they hear the word trust, a legal instrument, an accounting problem, a ledger that lives in a lawyer's safe. When my parents died, the trust they left behind was all of that, and more, a promise. Robert and Elizabeth Peterson were not lavish people, but they had built an estate over decades, a collection of properties, investments, and a small private museum my mother adored. The trust was explicit. It named me as sole trustee. It set aside roughly $42 million in assets and generated about $2.1 million a year. It was meant to support family members who treated one another with dignity, to maintain the museum, to honor my parents' memory. I took the job seriously. I moved from the city to the landscape my parents loved. I cataloged paintings, handled taxes, negotiated maintenance contracts. I made sure the maintenance crew didn't ruin the flower beds my mother had planted. I paid allowances when they were due. Tom had been receiving about $300,000 a year, plus a house to live in, utilities, staff, the sort of unearned comforts that let entitlement grow like mold in the corners. For 6 years, I let him live like a king, because I thought stewardship required restraint, not constant policing. I believed the trust's power was a last resort. People change, I told myself. Family heals. Some things are worth tolerating for the greater good. That night, with Maya's dress in my hands and her whisper still in my ears, Uncle Tom kicked me out because my mom is albino. I realized how wrong I had been about toleration. There are lines you don't cross when children are involved. The next morning, I drove out to the estate. It was an early blue day, the sort of color that makes white columns and marble look colder than they are. On the terrace, the big family portrait, the one taken every year for the holiday cards, had been set up for retouching. There were crates of orchids, a ladder, a photographer fussing with light. Tom stood by the French doors, a cup of coffee in one hand, the other resting on the back of a chair. He smiled at me with a practiced ease that didn't reach his eyes. Patricia hovered nearby in a dress that tried to signal belonging and failed. Harold Blackwood, our family attorney, arrived 15 minutes after me, carrying a briefcase with the kind of hinge that announces competence before he speaks. He did not sit down to chat. He opened the briefcase and handed me a sealed envelope. "You called, Sarah?" he said. His voice was the sort of thing that made a room quiet. I asked everyone to come inside. They thought it would be another small domestic correction, a billing issue, the electricity to be negotiated, the sort of household bureaucracy they could dismiss with a laugh. Instead, I asked them to sit together in the living room. No theatrics, just the set of faces that would have to answer for what had become of our family. I told Harold quietly what Maya had said. I told him the bruise and showed him the photographs on my phone I had taken that morning. He didn't react with shock. He reacted with the calibration of someone who reads deeds for a living. He put his briefcase on his knee and pulled out copies of the trust. He read the relevant clause aloud. Distributions shall be made only to beneficiaries who conduct themselves toward one another with dignity and respect, and the trustee shall have sole discretion to determine compliance. It was precise. It was irrevocable. It was everything my parents had entrusted me to enforce. Tom smiled, faltered. "This is ridiculous," he said. "Maya had been playing in the hall. She's accident-prone. You're making a scene." "I'm not making a scene," I said. "You're just so good at staging one." My voice stayed even. Harold handed me a stack of envelopes with itemized accounts.
"These are your benefits, Thomas," he said. "Your allowance has been disbursed at $300,000 annually. The trust also pays for residence and maintenance, which combined amount to roughly $400,000 per year." "That's absurd," Tom snapped, as though the numbers themselves were an offense rather than part of a structure he'd been living off. Harold looked at him over his glasses. "According to the records, you've used family properties as collateral without authorization."
David's investment was made on the strength of representations you made about available collateral. That investment lost $200,000. There are also losses associated with allowances you used in ways not permitted under estate policy, totaling approximately $300,000. The room shifted. I could feel the old hierarchy loosening, like a chain being cut. "What are you doing?" Patricia whispered. Her mascara had run like the rest of her composure. I laid out what I had to do. The trust gave me authority, but the way I used it would show whether I was a vindictive sibling or a responsible steward. Vindication had never been the point. Protection had. There was a difference. I read the steps I planned to take, without drama, as if reciting a maintenance checklist. The legal instruments have their own sort of mercy. They impose boundaries, and within those boundaries, life continues. First, immediate suspension of further discretionary payouts. The regular allowance that had been $300,000 a year would be paused. Second, a reduction of the living allowance to $100,000 for the interim period, to be reviewed upon compliance with conditions. Third, the residence would be subject to an inventory and appraisal. Property management would be engaged to oversee maintenance moving forward. Fourth, they would be given 60 days to vacate the residence if they could not demonstrate adherence to the trust's standards of dignity and respect. Finally, supervised contact with the child and a formal apology to her were required for consideration of restored privileges. The words landed like stones. Tom reddened. His protests became shouts, but when Harold read clauses and cited accounts, the hot air went out of him. His bluster doesn't crumble from accusations. It crumbles when someone produces ink and signatures and the mechanical certainty of law. I watched the man who had held his life in the notion of entitlement shrink as the ledger opened like daylight. "You can't do that," he said. "You have no right to—" "I have every right," I interrupted, and I did not feel triumphant. I felt exhausted with sorrow. This is not about taking a house for myself. This is about ensuring the safety of my child and honoring my parents' intent. You were given shelter and allowance because we trusted you to be a relative, not a monarch." Patricia sobbed, a small, sharp sound that seemed too human for the scale of the estate. Margaret, Aunt Margaret, who'd been one of the few to keep a fragile moral compass in our family, looked at me with relief and fear braided together. David sat quietly, rubbing his jaw, haunted by the $200,000 loss he had assumed because he believed in Tom's promises. He had been misled, and he had paid for it. "You're going to put him out on the street?" Tom snarled to Harold. 60 days to vacate is the period agreed upon in the contingency clause if the trustee determines a breach of dignity and safety toward beneficiaries, Harold said. This is not eviction in the criminal sense. This is the enforcement of trustee discretion, consistent with the trust's terms. We will provide documentation and assist in relocation arrangements, but there will be increased oversight, inventory, appraisal, and a reduction in discretionary funds until compliance is shown. I said carefully, "He will be given time to gather his things. We will coordinate humane transition. But until he can demonstrate accountability, until Maya is made whole, the privileges cease." That day, I didn't perform justice. I exercised duty. I made decisions that would change the contours of many lives, because one small life had been harmed. The calmness in my voice was not a mask. It was the only way I could operate. Anger can be useful, but unchecked anger doesn't solve problems. Documents and deadlines and inventory lists do. In the weeks that followed, the estate team completed an appraisal. The residence was inventoried. Property management took over the day-to-day. Tom, who had always relied on the certainty of a roof he did not maintain and staff he did not supervise, found himself facing invoices and schedules and a timeline for moving. The allowance was reduced to $100,000. Patricia, who loved the appearance of belonging more than the work of it, left sooner than many expected. I expected reaction. I expected legal challenges, sympathetic op-eds.
relatives who would clutch the family name and decry coldness. I prepared for calls and for scrutiny. What I did not expect was the buried relief I felt when the first boxes left the house. The place felt less like a set and more like a home that could breathe. People asked me, later, privately, sometimes with a little astonishment, if I had wanted to humiliate Tom. No, I told them. Humiliation is easy. Responsibility is hard. I could have made a spectacle, chased him out with lawyers at my hip, posted the particulars on a social feed to serve as moral theater. Instead, I counted the receipts, made lists of required apologies, and drafted a plan where restitution and monitored re-entry would be possible. That's the kind of revenge I believe in, the one that rebuilds what was broken rather than multiplies injury. Maya watched the changes like a child watches the weather. One afternoon, she came into my office and folded her hands on the desk, the way she does when she wants to seem very grown up. "Did he have to leave because of the bruise?" she asked. "It wasn't the bruise alone," I said. "It was how he talked about you. That was the worst part." She frowned. "That word," he said. "Why would he say that?" "Because sometimes people pick a word to make someone feel smaller," I told her. "They do it when they're trying to hold more than they earned. They point to what they think is different and pretend it's the reason. But it's not. We are who we are. What matters is how we treat one another." "You made him say sorry?" she asked.
I demanded an apology, I said. An apology to you, to me, and an apology that is visible. Words without action are cheap. So we set conditions. An apology in writing, supervised visits so you can decide when you're ready, and a plan to make changes if he wants to be part of our lives again. I insisted, and Harold backed me, that apology be more than the sound of a mouth. It had to be accompanied by evidence of changed behavior, counseling, proof of financial transparency, and reparations for the costs David had incurred when he trusted Tom's representations. That $200,000 loss did not vanish. We opened a conversation about restitution and accountability. Tom's financial narrative could no longer be sustained by charm alone. There were those who whispered that we had money problems, as if the very fact of our means explained cruelty. But the numbers mattered in a different way. Wealth had been used as a shield. The $42 million estate and $2.1 million yearly yield were not symbols of righteousness. They were instruments that could be wielded for harm if left unchecked. I treated them as instruments to repair harm. In the months after, the museum's director restructured the volunteer program to better screen those who interacted with children. We arranged for security upgrades the trust had long resisted because it wasn't necessary. It was necessary. We hired a child protection consultant to train staff and to draft supervised visit policies. We did not act out of spite. We acted out of prevention. Tom moved out within the 60 days, his face a mixture of anger and something like confusion at being mortal in the face of paperwork. Patricia sold the antiques she'd been milking for appearances. David pursued a claim for the misrepresented collateral. His legal expenses were added to our ledger as a matter we would pursue through the appropriate channels. The trust's board convened and agreed to increased oversight measures to prevent unilateral financial behavior. We required that any use of property as collateral be documented, approved by the trustee, and disclosed to all relevant parties. It was a tightening that the house needed. Maya began to heal in the ways children do, slowly in fits and starts. The bruises faded, of course. The bigger work, of trust, of feeling safe, took longer. We spent afternoons building forts in the living room, reading aloud until our voices slurred, baking cookies as a practice in normalcy. I taught her how to name feelings, to say, "That hurt me," without shame, to tell an adult when boundaries are crossed. "You are not less," I told her often. "You are loved, you are protected." On a rainy afternoon, when the house felt like a warm ship, she asked me, "Will he ever be sorry for calling you names?" "He will have to show it," I said. "Words are easy. Actions are the proof."
Sometimes, after long days of meetings and inventories and calls with appraisal firms, I would sit in my office and think of the cost of complacency. I had once believed that family conflicts should be handled gently, privately, that exposure would only harden wounds. But gentleness without action is not protection. My parents had left me an obligation and the tools to fulfill it, and when push came to shove, I used them to close off avenues for harm. There were personal costs. Family members we thought steady drifted away, cousins took sides, invitations stopped arriving. But the people who mattered, the ones who had been quietly peasant, who had raised their eyebrows at things they didn't like but endured, who came forward when asked, those were the ones who remained. Margaret called me that winter and said simply, "You did right." It was the smallest praise and the most sustaining. We published a short statement to the Trust newsletter. The Trust was under new management in certain aspects, not to trumpet retribution, but to tell everyone responsible for overseeing the assets that there would be accountability. It was a concise, factual letter that laid out the steps without rancor. The public doesn't need to know the details of family pain, but they do need to know that institutions which hold power will not allow it to be a cover for harm. One evening, after a day of signing appraisal reports and meeting with the museum's conservator, Maya crawled into bed with her stuffed rabbit and said, "Do you wish Grandpa was still here?" "Every day," I said, "but he put things in place for his grandchildren. He trusted me to act when needed. I'm just doing what he would have asked." She squeezed her rabbit and drifted toward sleep. I thought of the contrast between a man who thought ownership equaled entitlement and the kind of authority that comes from responsibility. There are two kinds of power, I believe: the power to possess and the power to protect. I chose the latter. It was quieter and less glamorous, but it held a house together that might otherwise have cracked. Months later, the appraisal came back better than we feared. The property values held, the museum's endowment was reassessed and strengthened by a donor who admired the governance changes. David's claim was proceeding through the appropriate channels. We were not eager for litigation, but we were clear. Misrepresentation has consequences. Tom filed objections and then quietly negotiated a settlement that included restitution and a staged path to possible reinstatement of limited privileges, contingent on meeting the trust conditions. I never wanted to be the villain in my family's story. I wanted to be the steward. There is a temptation to equate firmness with vindictiveness, but protecting your child against cruelty is not revenge, it's care. The revenge people like to imagine, dramatic, vindictive, humiliating, was not mine.
My revenge was the sober application of the trust's terms, reducing privileges, insisting on accountability, securing the estate so that wealth could not be used as a weapon. When I told Maya about the decisions, I framed them simply. We made rules, so this can't happen again. We asked Tom to make things right. If he chooses to, he'll come back by proving he deserves trust. Will he? She asked, the same way you might ask whether a scraped knee will ever stop hurting. Maybe, I said, but whether he does or not doesn't change the fact that you are safe and loved. At the end of the day, the hardest part was not implementing the measures. It was living with the knowledge that a family member had thought to make a child feel less than. That line Tom had used, the hateful phrase my daughter repeated, was designed to wound, to make us feel shame, to buy power through shame. Calling that out, rejecting it, ensuring our child would not carry it as a private burden, that was the remedy. If there's any advice I would offer to someone who finds themselves in a similar place, it would be this. Use your authority to protect, not to punish for pleasure. Document everything. Consult counsel. Prioritize the safety of the vulnerable. Keep your voice calm. Your decisions will speak louder than outrage. And remember that stewardship is not about hoarding comfort, but about distributing care. If you've ever been in a situation where you had to choose between family face and a child's dignity, you know how isolating that choice can be. You don't have to make it alone. Find counsel. Draw up the lists. Take the photographs. Keep your heart tender, even as your hands do the work. We still visit the museum. We still host family dinners, albeit different now. There are quiet dinners where awkward silences once were. There are new policies in place for who supervises tours when schoolchildren come through the galleries. We have training for staff. We have a small fund set aside for child protection measures. We have, most importantly, Maya's trust that when she is hurt, I will act. The house isn't the same, and that's okay. It belongs to a family that now understands that dignity is not optional. The man who once believed a house and an allowance could buy him immunity is rebuilding a life with more paperwork and fewer assumptions. Whether he finds his way back into our circle depends on what he chooses to do now. If this story matters to you, if it stirs something you want to talk about or share with someone who needs to hear they are not alone, please subscribe for more true life stories about people choosing protection over pretense. Tell me in the comments if you've ever had to make a similar choice, or if you've been the one who needed protection. We heal by telling the truth, and by refusing to let shame define our children.